Boring history for sleep. Life inside a pharaoh's palace. Welcome to another journey through the quiet corners of history. Tonight we're stepping into the golden halls of ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh's palace stood as the beating heart of a civilization that would outlast empires. Behind the towering columns and painted walls, life unfolded with rituals, hierarchies, and daily routines that governed the most powerful rulers on earth. The palace wasn't just a residence, it was a world unto itself, a place where the divine met the mundane, where the pharaoh balanced the responsibilities of godhood with the simple human need for food, rest, and companionship. Here, scribes bent over papyrus scrolls in lamplit chambers, servants moved silently through corridors carrying offerings and messages, priests performed daily rituals to maintain cosmic order. And at the center of it all, the pharaoh navigated the delicate balance between earthly power and divine obligation. Picture the palace at dawn. The Nile reflected golden light through tall windows as the royal household stirred to life. Servants prepared the morning meal, while priests readied themselves for the daily temple rituals. The pharaoh's personal attendants began the elaborate process of royal grooming, applying oils and arranging the ceremonial regalia that transformed a mortal ruler into the living embodiment of Horus. The palace kitchens were marvels of organization. Bread was baked in massive ovens that never fully cooled. Beer was brewed in large vats, not just for pleasure, but as a dietary staple safer than water. Meat was prepared with precision, roasted over fires tended by skilled cooks who understood that feeding the pharaoh was a sacred duty. Fruits and vegetables arrived daily from the royal gardens, where gardeners cultivated everything from onions and garlic to dates and figs. But palace life extended far beyond the pharaoh's immediate needs. The complex housed hundreds of people, each with specific roles in maintaining the royal household. There were scribes who recorded everything from tax collections to religious festivals. There were craftsmen who created the furniture, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that filled the palace chambers. There were guards who protected the royal family, musicians who provided entertainment, and servants who ensured that every aspect of daily life ran smoothly. The pharaoh's day began before sunrise with personal rituals of purification. Royal attendants would help bathe and dress the ruler in linen garments that had been blessed by priests. The morning meal was served on golden plates, accompanied by prayers and offerings to ensure the day's success. After breaking the fast, the pharaoh would proceed to the throne room for the day's first audiences, where officials, priests, and foreign ambassadors awaited royal attention. The throne room itself was designed to inspire awe. Massive columns painted with scenes of the pharaoh's divine ancestry rose to a ceiling decorated with stars representing the heavens. The throne, carved from precious wood and inlaid with gold and gems, sat elevated above the floor so that all who approached had to look up at their divine ruler. Guards flanked the throne while scribes sat nearby to record important decisions and proclamations. Palace meals were elaborate affairs that combined nourishment with ceremony. The royal table featured bread baked from the finest wheat, meat from cattle fattened on the best pastures, fish caught fresh from the Nile, and wine imported from distant vineyards. Each dish was prepared according to ancient recipes and presented with ritualistic precision. The pharaoh ate with utensils made of gold and silver, while servants stood ready to refill cups and replace empty platters. The pharaoh's sleeping quarters represented the ultimate in ancient luxury. The bed was carved from ebony and cedar, draped with the finest linen sheets and surrounded by furniture inlaid with ivory and precious metals. Servants would burn incense to purify the air, while guards maintained silent watch throughout the night. Even sleep was considered a sacred time when the pharaoh's spirit traveled to commune with the gods. Palace entertainment reflected the sophisticated culture of ancient Egypt. Musicians played harps, flutes, and drums during evening gatherings. Dancers performed sacred and secular routines that told stories of gods and heroes. Storytellers recounted tales of ancient pharaohs and mythical adventures. Games of Senet, the ancient Egyptian board game, provided intellectual diversion, while acrobats and jugglers offered more physical entertainment. The palace workshops buzzed with constant activity. Goldsmiths crafted jewelry and ceremonial objects. Weavers created the fine linen garments worn by the royal family. Carpenters built furniture and decorative elements. Stone carvers worked on statues and architectural details. Every artisan understood that their work contributed to the glory of the pharaoh and, by extension, the stability of Egypt itself. Religious observance permeated every aspect of palace life. The pharaoh participated in daily rituals designed to maintain cosmic order and ensure the gods' continued favor. Private chapels within the palace complex hosted morning and evening ceremonies. Priests offered prayers and sacrifices on behalf of the royal family. Even mundane activities like meals and bathing were accompanied by religious formulas and protective spells. The palace gardens provided both beauty and sustenance. Carefully tended plots produced vegetables and herbs for the royal table. Ornamental pools stocked with fish offered peaceful retreats from the demands of rulership. Date palms and fruit trees provided shade and sweet delicacies. Flower beds filled the air with fragrances that masked the less pleasant odors of ancient urban life. Palace security was elaborate and ever-present. Guards patrolled the corridors day and night. Trusted servants monitored access to the royal quarters. Foreign visitors were carefully screened and escorted. The pharaoh's food was tested for poison by designated tasters. Even the royal family's movements within the palace were tracked and protected. The royal wardrobe reflected both practical needs and divine symbolism. Linen garments were chosen for their comfort in Egypt's hot climate and their association with purity. Royal crowns and ceremonial headdresses marked the pharaoh's divine status. Jewelry served both decorative and protective purposes, with amulets designed to ward off evil influences. Even the pharaoh's sandals were crafted from precious materials and decorated with symbols of power. Palace life followed seasonal rhythms tied to the Nile's annual flood cycle. During the inundation, when farmland was underwater, the palace became a center of planning and preparation for the coming agricultural year. As the floods receded, attention turned to overseeing planting and irrigation. Harvest time brought celebrations and offerings of thanksgiving to the gods who had provided abundance. The pharaoh's education never truly ended. Palace scholars provided ongoing instruction in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and theology. Royal advisors offered counsel on matters of state. Foreign ambassadors brought news and knowledge from distant lands. The palace library housed scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian civilization, available for the pharaoh's study and reflection. Palace ceremonies marked every significant event in the royal calendar. Coronation anniversaries were celebrated with elaborate festivals. Religious holidays brought special rituals and offerings. Royal birthdays occasioned gift-giving and public celebrations. Even smaller milestones like the completion of building projects or successful diplomatic negotiations were marked with appropriate ceremony. The pharaoh's family life unfolded within this formal structure. Royal children received education in languages, mathematics, and religious instruction. Queens and royal wives maintained their own households within the palace complex. Family meals combined intimate conversation with the formal protocols of royal dining. Even play and relaxation were conducted according to established customs and traditions. Palace communications networks kept the pharaoh connected to every corner of the kingdom. Messengers arrived daily with reports from provincial governors. Scribes maintained detailed records of tax collections, military activities, and local conditions. Foreign correspondents brought news from neighboring kingdoms and trading partners. The pharaoh's decisions rippled outward from the palace to affect millions of subjects throughout Egypt. As evening approached, the palace settled into quieter rhythms. The day's official business concluded with final audiences and administrative meetings. Dinner was served by lamplight, accompanied by gentle music and conversation. The pharaoh might review documents, consult with advisors, or simply enjoy the company of family and trusted friends. Gradually, the great complex grew still as its inhabitants prepared for sleep. The palace archives preserved the records of daily life for posterity. Scribes documented everything from royal decrees to household expenses. Religious texts were copied and preserved for future generations. Historical records chronicled the achievements of each pharaoh's reign. Art and literature flourished under royal patronage, creating works that would inspire and educate future Egyptians. Palace medicine combined practical knowledge with spiritual healing. Royal physicians were among the most skilled in Egypt, trained in surgery, pharmacology, and diagnostic techniques. The pharaoh's health was monitored constantly, with preventive treatments and protective rituals designed to maintain royal well-being. Palace pharmacies stocked remedies made from plants, minerals, and animal products gathered from throughout the known world. The palace economy was a microcosm of Egyptian society. Farmers supplied grain and livestock, craftsmen provided manufactured goods, traders brought exotic imports from distant lands. The royal treasury managed vast wealth in gold, silver, and precious stones. Administrative officials oversaw the complex logistics of feeding, housing, and supporting hundreds of palace residents. Palace diplomacy shaped Egypt's relationships with neighboring powers. Foreign ambassadors were received with elaborate ceremony designed to display Egyptian wealth and power. Royal gifts were exchanged according to ancient protocols. Marriage alliances were negotiated to cement political relationships. Trade agreements were crafted to benefit Egyptian merchants and artisans. As night deepened, the palace settled into its nocturnal routines. Guards continued their vigilant patrols. Servants prepared for the next day's activities. The pharaoh retired to the royal bedchamber, where the day's responsibilities gave way to the restorative power of sleep. In dreams, the divine ruler might commune with gods, receive prophetic visions, or simply rest in the knowledge that another day of service to Egypt had been completed. The palace represented more than royal luxury. It embodied the Egyptian ideal of order emerging from chaos, of divine will expressed through human action. Every ritual, every ceremony, every daily routine contributed to the maintenance of cosmic balance that ensured Egypt's continued prosperity. Within these walls, the pharaoh served not only as ruler, but as the essential link between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. And so the palace slept, its chambers filled with the gentle sounds of a civilization at rest. The Nile flowed past as it had for thousands of years, carrying the promise of tomorrow's renewal. In the royal quarters, surrounded by the symbols of divine kingship, the pharaoh rested in preparation for another day of maintaining the eternal order that was ancient Egypt. The palace kitchens never truly slept. Even in the depths of night, servants tended fires that would roar back to life before dawn, preparing for another day of feeding hundreds of mouths. The royal kitchen complex sprawled across multiple chambers, each with its own purpose. There were rooms for baking bread, others for roasting meat, and specialized areas for preparing the delicate pastries and sweetmeats that pharaohs favored. Head cooks held positions of remarkable influence. They controlled not just the preparation of food, but the very rhythms of palace life. These master chefs understood that a pharaoh's mood could shift with the quality of his morning meal, that successful diplomatic dinners required perfect timing, and that religious festivals demanded specific foods prepared in ancient, prescribed ways. The ingredients that flowed through these kitchens told the story of Egypt's reach across the known world, honey from the delta mixed with cinnamon from distant lands. Fresh fish from the Nile was seasoned with black pepper that had traveled thousands of miles. Date wine from palace orchards was served alongside imported oils that cost more than most people earned in a year. Storage was an art form in itself. Deep underground chambers, cool and dry, housed enormous clay jars filled with grain. These granaries could sustain the palace through years of poor harvests. Other rooms held amphorae of oil, wine, and vinegar, their surfaces marked with hieroglyphs indicating contents, origin, and vintage. The brewing of beer, Egypt's daily drink, required its own dedicated space. Master brewers worked with different grains to create varieties ranging from the light, everyday beer consumed by servants to the rich, honey-sweetened brews reserved for Pharaoh himself. The process was both practical and sacred, with specific prayers offered to ensure the fermentation proceeded properly. Even the preparation of simple meals involved elaborate ceremony. Royal bread wasn't merely baked, it was crafted. Bakers shaped loaves into symbolic forms, animals representing gods, geometric patterns that echoed temple decorations, miniature pyramids that reminded everyone of Pharaoh's eternal destiny. Palace feasts transformed these kitchens into theaters of controlled chaos. Dozens of cooks worked in careful coordination, their movements choreographed like a religious dance. Timing was everything. Hot dishes had to arrive at tables while still steaming. Cold preparations needed to maintain their perfect temperature. And through it all, tasters sampled every dish, not just for poison, but to ensure it met the exacting standards expected at Pharaoh's table. The servants who carried these meals into the dining halls moved with practiced grace. They understood that presentation was as important as taste. Golden plates caught candlelight just so. Wine was poured at precisely the right moment. Even the arrangement of bread on serving platters followed ancient protocols that connected each meal to the cosmic order Pharaoh represented. Beyond the kitchens lay the palace workshops, where skilled artisans created the objects that surrounded royal life. The carpenter's workshop rang with the sound of hammers and chisels as craftsmen shaped cedar wood imported from Lebanon. These weren't ordinary furniture makers. They were artists who understood that every chair, every chest, every decorative panel would be scrutinized by Pharaoh and his court. Royal furniture reflected both practical needs and spiritual beliefs. Chairs weren't just seats, they were thrones in miniature, carved with protective symbols and inlaid with precious materials. Storage chests became canvases for intricate paintings that told stories of Pharaoh's victories or depicted scenes from religious texts. The woodworkers shared their complex with metalworkers who hammered gold into delicate jewelry and shaped silver into ceremonial vessels. The sound of their work created a constant rhythmic backdrop to palace life. Hammers striking metal, files smoothing rough edges, the hiss of hot metal meeting water for tempering. These craftsmen worked with materials that spoke of Egypt's wealth and reach. Gold from Nubian mines was so pure it barely required refinement. Silver arrived as tribute from northern kingdoms. Copper and tin were carefully alloyed to create bronze tools and decorative objects that would last for millennia. Nearby, Scribes bent over papyrus in workshops that smelled of ink and reed pens. These weren't merely clerks recording daily transactions, they were the keepers of knowledge, responsible for maintaining the vast written records that kept the kingdom functioning, every grain of wheat distributed, every worker assigned to a project, every diplomatic message sent to foreign courts. All of it was carefully documented in their precise hieroglyphic script. The scribes worked by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across their scrolls. Their reed pens scratched softly against papyrus as they recorded the endless details of palace administration. Tax records, legal decisions, religious calendars, architectural plans. The business of ruling an empire generated thousands of documents that had to be written, copied, filed, and preserved. Some scribes specialized in correspondence, crafting the diplomatic letters that maintained Egypt's relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Others focused on religious texts, copying sacred writings with reverent precision. Still others served as personal secretaries to high officials, following them through the palace halls with portable writing kits, ready to record any important decision or instruction. The palace textile workshops hummed with different sounds, the rhythmic clacking of looms, the soft whisper of spinning wheels, the gentle voices of women working together on complex embroidery projects. Royal clothing wasn't simply sewn, it was engineered to communicate status, wealth, and divine connection. Linen was the foundation of Egyptian clothing, and palace weavers worked with the finest grades available. The thread was so thin it seemed almost translucent, yet when woven into cloth, it created garments of surprising durability. Royal linen was bleached to brilliant whiteness, using techniques that were closely guarded secrets. But it was the decoration of these textiles that truly showcased palace craftsmanship. Gold thread was worked into intricate patterns that caught and reflected light with every movement. Precious stones were sewn into hems and collars, creating garments that served as wearable treasure. The patterns themselves carried meaning. Lotus blossoms for rebirth, Ankh symbols for life, protective eyes to ward off evil. The dyers worked with their own specialized knowledge, creating colors that had never been seen before. Royal purple came from shells gathered along distant coastlines. Deep blues were extracted from rare minerals. Reds ranged from the bright scarlet of certain insects to the deep crimson of specific plants, each requiring different techniques and producing subtly different effects. Palace embroiderers, often women of noble birth who had dedicated their lives to the craft, created works of art that happened to be clothing. Their needles moved with precision born of decades of practice, creating scenes so detailed they resembled paintings. A pharaoh's ceremonial robe might depict his entire family tree, with each figure rendered in perfect miniature using colored threads. The jewelry workshops represented perhaps the highest level of palace craftsmanship. Here, goldsmiths worked with techniques that wouldn't be improved upon for thousands of years. They could create gold wire thinner than human hair, hammer sheets of metal until they were nearly transparent, and inlay precious stones with such precision that no gaps were visible between different materials. Royal jewelry served multiple purposes beyond simple adornment. Amulets provided spiritual protection, their shapes and materials chosen according to complex religious formulas. Crowns and diadems marked specific ceremonies and occasions. Even everyday jewelry carried symbolic meaning, with different pieces appropriate for different times of day or seasons of the year. The creation of a single royal necklace might take months. First, the design had to be approved by court officials who understood its symbolic implications. Then goldsmiths shaped each individual element, often creating hundreds of tiny identical pieces that would be assembled into the final design. Gem cutters prepared precious stones, polishing them to perfect smoothness and cutting them to exact specifications. The palace perfume workshops created another invisible layer of royal luxury. Egyptian perfumers were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill in creating complex, long-lasting fragrances. They worked with ingredients gathered from across the known world: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Somalia, rose petals from Persia, cedar oil from Lebanon. These weren't simple flower waters. Palace perfumes were sophisticated blends that changed throughout the day, revealing different notes as they interacted with skin and air. A single fragrance might combine dozens of ingredients, each added in precise quantities according to recipes that were passed down through generations of perfumers. The creation of perfume was part chemistry, part art, part magic. Perfumers understood that scent could influence mood, attract favorable attention, and even provide spiritual protection. Different fragrances were created for different occasions: light, floral scents for morning audiences, rich, complex blends for evening banquets, sacred incenses for religious ceremonies. Oil was the base for most perfumes, with different oils chosen for their own properties. Some absorbed and held fragrance better than others. Some had beneficial effects on skin. Others were chosen for their symbolic significance or their supposed ability to enhance the magical properties of the added aromatics. The mixing process could take weeks. Ingredients were combined in specific sequences, with some additions requiring precise timing. The mixture was then aged, sometimes for months, to allow the different elements to blend and mature. Master perfumers could predict how a fragrance would develop over time, creating scents that would reach their peak just when they were needed. Throughout all these workshops, apprentices learned skills that would take decades to master. The knowledge of palace craftsmen wasn't written down in books. It was passed directly from master to student through years of careful observation and practice. A young goldsmith might spend months learning to hold tools properly before being allowed to work on actual jewelry. Apprentice perfumers began by simply observing their masters, gradually learning to identify hundreds of different scents by smell alone. This system of apprenticeship ensured that palace workshops maintained their high standards across generations. But it also meant that the loss of a master craftsman could represent the disappearance of irreplaceable knowledge. The palace therefore treated its skilled artisans with considerable respect, providing them with comfortable housing, excellent food, and the kind of job security that allowed them to focus entirely on perfecting their crafts. The workshops operated according to schedules that balanced efficiency with quality. Rush orders from Pharaoh himself could disrupt normal routines, requiring craftsmen to work through the night to complete urgent projects. But most work proceeded at a measured pace that allowed for the careful attention to detail that palace standards demanded. Quality control was rigorous. Every finished piece was inspected by master craftsmen who had the authority to reject work that didn't meet palace standards. Rejected pieces might be reworked, relegated to use by lower-ranking officials, or even melted down and started over. The reputation of palace workshops depended on maintaining standards so high that receiving a gift made in the royal workshops was considered a tremendous honor. The sounds, smells, and sights of these workshops created their own distinctive atmosphere within the palace. The ring of hammers, the whisper of spinning wheels, the scratch of pens on papyrus, the sizzle of hot wax, the soft voices of artisans discussing their work, all of this blended into a backdrop that spoke of productive creativity and careful craftsmanship. Even the organization of the workshops reflected Egyptian values. Work areas were kept scrupulously clean, not just for practical reasons, but because cleanliness was associated with religious purity. Tools were maintained in perfect condition and stored in designated places. Raw materials were sorted and labeled with the same precision that scribes brought to their written records. The palace workshops represented more than just centers of production. They were repositories of knowledge, training grounds for the next generation of craftsmen, and symbols of the wealth and sophistication that Pharaoh's rule made possible. Every object they produced carried with it the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Egyptian craftsmanship, embodying the civilization's highest ideals in forms that could be worn, used, and treasured. As night deepened around these busy workshops, the rhythm of work gradually slowed. Oil lamps were banked but not extinguished. Tools were cleaned and put away, and the palace settled into the quieter routines of evening. But the creative energy that filled these spaces during the day seemed to linger in the air, a promise that tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, and new opportunities to transform raw materials into objects worthy of the pharaoh's divine presence. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the palace of the pharaoh began its slow transition into the deepest hours of night. The last oil lamps flickered in the halls where scribes had been working late into the evening, recording the day's decrees and updating the endless scrolls that documented every aspect of palace life. Guards walked their prescribed routes along corridors that had witnessed countless nights before this one, their leather sandals whispering against stone floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. In the royal quarters, the pharaoh himself might have retired to chambers cooled by ingenious ventilation systems that drew the night air through carefully positioned openings. His sleeping chamber was a marvel of comfort for its time, with fine linen sheets, cushions stuffed with the softest down, and walls painted with protective deities who were believed to watch over the divine ruler as he slept. The pharaoh's dreams were considered prophetic, messages from the gods that might influence decisions of state upon his awakening. Even as the palace settled into its nighttime rhythm, activity never truly ceased. In the kitchens, bakers began their work before dawn, kneading dough for the bread that would feed hundreds of palace inhabitants. The ovens, massive stone structures that retained heat for hours, were carefully tended by workers who had inherited their skills from their fathers and grandfathers. The scent of baking bread would soon mingle with the cool night air, creating one of the most comforting aromas known to human civilization. The palace workshops, too, maintained a quiet productivity through the night hours. Goldsmiths worked by lamplight, crafting delicate jewelry and ceremonial objects with tools that were themselves works of art. Their techniques, passed down through generations of master craftsmen, produced objects of such beauty and precision that they would be treasured for millennia. Each piece they created was not merely decorative but carried deep symbolic meaning, incorporating hieroglyphs and religious motifs that connected the wearer to the divine realm. In the temple complex within the palace walls, priests maintained the eternal flames that were never allowed to die. These sacred fires represented the eternal nature of the pharaoh's divine authority and the unbroken connection between earth and the heavens. The priests who tended these flames worked in shifts, ensuring that the gods were never left unattended, that the proper offerings were made at the appointed hours, and that the cosmic order remained undisturbed. The palace library, perhaps one of the most remarkable spaces in the entire complex, housed thousands of papyrus scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian civilization. Here, scribes worked by the light of carefully positioned oil lamps, copying important texts and creating new works. The knowledge preserved in this space encompassed everything from medical treatments and mathematical calculations to astronomical observations and religious texts. The librarians who oversaw this collection were among the most learned individuals in the kingdom, responsible for maintaining not just the physical scrolls, but the intellectual heritage of their civilization. As the night deepened, the palace guards continued their vigilant watch from towers and walls that offered commanding views of the surrounding landscape. These sentries were trained to recognize the slightest disturbance, whether it might be an approaching messenger with urgent news or the movements of wildlife in the river valley below. Their watchfulness was part of an elaborate security system that protected not just the pharaoh's physical person, but the stability of the entire kingdom. The palace's water systems continued their quiet operation throughout the night, drawing from deep wells and channeling the precious resource through a network of channels and basins. The sound of flowing water was a constant, soothing presence in the palace, a reminder of the Nile's life-giving power and the engineering skills that had made such comfort possible even in the desert. Servants responsible for maintaining these systems worked quietly to ensure that fresh water would be available for the morning's ablutions and ceremonies. In the quarters housing the palace officials and their families, the night brought its own activities. Children were told stories that had been passed down for generations, tales of gods and heroes that served both to entertain and to educate about proper behavior and the values of their civilization. These bedtime stories were often accompanied by simple music, played on flutes or harps, creating an atmosphere of warmth and security within the vast palace complex. The palace's connection to the cosmic order was never more apparent than during these quiet night hours. The building itself had been oriented according to astronomical principles, with certain chambers and corridors aligned to capture specific celestial events. During particular seasons, moonlight would fall precisely on certain statues or hieroglyphic inscriptions, creating moments of ethereal beauty that reinforced the divine nature of pharaonic rule. Even the palace's domestic animals played their part in the nighttime routine. Sacred cats, revered throughout Egypt, roamed the corridors and storage areas, performing the practical service of controlling rodents, while also serving as living symbols of divine protection. These cats were well cared for, with some even being mummified upon their death and buried with honor befitting their sacred status. The craftsmen's quarters buzzed with quiet activity as artisans worked on projects that required careful attention to detail. Furniture makers carved intricate designs into chairs and tables that would grace the pharaoh's halls, while textile workers created fabrics of such fine quality that they would be suitable for royal garments or temple hangings. Each of these craftsmen took pride in their work, knowing that their creations would be part of the pharaoh's divine splendor. As the night progressed toward dawn, the palace began its gradual awakening. The changing of the guard occurred with practiced precision, each sentry taking up his assigned position with the solemnity befitting his sacred duty. The kitchen workers increased their pace, preparing for the morning meal that would need to feed not only the royal family, but also the hundreds of officials, servants, and workers who called the palace home. The palace's role as an administrative center meant that even in these quiet hours, important work continued. Tax records were updated, correspondence was prepared for distant provinces, and legal documents were drafted with the careful attention to detail that Egyptian bureaucracy demanded. The scribes who performed this work were among the most educated members of society, their skills in reading and writing making them indispensable to the functioning of the kingdom. In the palace's medical quarters, physicians and healers stood ready to respond to any emergency. Their knowledge combined practical understanding of anatomy and disease with spiritual practices designed to restore balance to both body and soul. The medical papyri they consulted contained centuries of accumulated wisdom about healing, making the palace's medical care among the most advanced available anywhere in the ancient world. The night also brought opportunities for private worship and meditation. Members of the royal family and high officials often spent time in personal prayer, seeking guidance from the gods for the challenges they would face in the coming day. These private devotions were considered just as important as the public ceremonies, representing the individual's personal relationship with the divine forces that governed Egyptian life. Throughout all of this activity, the palace maintained its character as a place where the earthly and divine realms intersected. Every aspect of its design, from the grandest ceremonial hall to the humblest servants' quarters, reflected the Egyptian understanding that the pharaoh was both human ruler and divine being. This duality shaped every interaction, every ritual, and every moment of daily life within the palace walls. As the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, the palace prepared for another day in its role as the beating heart of Egyptian civilization. The night had passed peacefully, with all the complex systems of palace life functioning smoothly under the watchful eyes of those entrusted with maintaining order. Soon, the pharaoh would emerge from his chambers to begin another day of ruling as both king and god, and the palace would once again become the stage for the grand theater of ancient Egyptian royal life. The eternal rhythm of palace life continued, as it had for generations and would for generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of Egyptian civilization and the divine authority of the pharaoh who ruled from this magnificent center of power and spirituality.